So, Roel, there's quite a lot we want to work through, but can you tell us why you wrote this particular book?
Yeah. When I was a student in history at the Free University, I looked for direction at a certain point. And then I went back in my own tradition and I read Unbelief and Revolution, the main work of Groen van Prinsterer. And then I found, well, this is an amazing guy with big thoughts, a soul of fire. It's one of the ways he's described, a soul of fire. And he was the first Christian to enter Parliament, so I was fascinated. I was really touched by reading that book, and I will tell later perhaps a little more about that book, Unbelief and Revolution. But then I wrote a dissertation, and in the dissertation I also used Groen van Prinsterer's idea about the nation state in the 19th century, his view on history, and his ideas about foreign policy. But then, during that time, I already had that idea, this man needs a new biography. There were some shorter ones in Dutch. I wrote this one first in Dutch, and now it is translated, and I've done some work to make it, to make it anew, to make it fresh again for an English reading audience.
Well, in my opinion, you've achieved that, 100%. So
thank you.
So one of the interesting things is there's discussion now about taking the Dooyeweerd book on a sort of world tour. And one of the things that exercises my mind and the mind of people like Michael Goheen, and that I talked to Kelsey about, we hadn't given a address on, is what would be involved today in a renewal of the Christian tradition. And so what intrigued me a lot in this narrative of Groen is the influence of the Reveil on Groen. Can you talk a bit about what it was and why it was so important for Groen and his wife? And then maybe at the end, were there limitations to the Reveil?
Yeah. The Reveil movement was in the beginning of the 19th century. It was an awakening of Christians, let's say a revival. The name is French, Reveil, so it was also in something in France, in French-speaking Switzerland, so in that area. But it also included later on circles of Christians in Germany and in England. The Evangelical Alliance came up in these times, so they all visited the meeting of the Evangelical Alliance in London, for instance, 1946 something, and they had contact with one another. So it was really the international movement of Christians, and Reveil is undogmatic. It's one of the characteristics, but it was pious. It was about living every day with Christ. Attentive for what faith does to the soul, but the peculiar thing in Groen is that he was not looking inward as many people did in the Reveil movement, thinking about emotions or feelings and let's say the pious thing of faith, but he wanted to express it publicly. And he inspired people like Roel Kuiper and indirectly also Dooyeweerd. They all knew and they all read Unbelief and Revolution, as I did as a student. It's the main work of Groen. So yes, and so let's say this about the Reveil movement. Yeah, and Kuiper would later say the Reveil movement lacked a theology. So they were, in a way, against academic theology, and why was that? Because academic theology was liberal theology. So they shied away on this academic theology, and they celebrated the faith life in its everyday experience. Groen was a wealthy man, so he had a big house in The Hague, and he had servants. And every morning, in the beginning of the day, they came together He and his wife, they had no children. He and his wife and the servants, and they prayed and read some lines from scripture. So that was the beginning of the day in his own house. It was typical for the Revival movement.
Yeah, and I think what struck me in the biography is that there's sort of moments in Paul's life where you feel the Spirit is powerfully at work.
Yeah.
And so there's not one moment.
Yeah.
But I do, we've heard a lot, for example, about the relevance of Dooyeweerd's philosophy for Christian and non-Christian. But a thing that interests me is, can you have this philosophy in a healthy way if you don't have the sort of devotion of the Reveil in a healthy way? So the way I've written the question down for you is, what, if anything, does this influence of the Reveil teach us about any renewal of the Kuiperian tradition today?
Yeah. We all know this distinction between pre-theoretical and theoretical, or the first, it's not naive, but the first experience we all have, and then the more philosophical or theoretical experience when you do some academic work. In a way, the Revival movement was the first experience. It was the faith experience full out. And when we want to learn from it, I think it's the spiritual basis. So I think it's important in this movement, that's the movement of Christian philosophy. We always sense that there is a spiritual root. This was important to Dooyeweerd, but it was very clearly in the work of Groen in his own experience. He converted to devoted Christianity in the end of his 20s. Can I read what he told himself about it? He said, after leaving the academy, I continued to observe the outward forms of religious obligation, but without any particular interest, and engaged in various studies. He says this, but I know that during his studies time, he every morning read a sermon for his own personal devotion. And now he's saying, what I did was to observe the outward religion. But I always consider religion as something separate rather than as a principle of life which should be united and interwoven with our whole existence. In the last 3 or 4 years, a number of circumstances have combined to give me an entirely different perspective on the matter. Among these circumstances, you will feel I include my marriage, the acquaintance and fellowship with men like Mallet d'Aubigné, so that was an important one, Sigretan was a pastor for him in The Hague, and finally the publication of the Netherlandic Reflections. He gave a pamphlet, which forced me to think more and more about the causes of evil, until finally the main cause, the systemic apostasy from Christianity, became clear to me. Since then, thousands of things have become clear to me that I once regarded as insoluble mysteries, and all of history has become for me one continuous confirmation of the truths revealed in Scripture. It could have been written by Roel Kuiper. Right? So it's the idea of the all-encompassing meaning and relevance of religion, right? Well, you ask about the work of the Holy Spirit. I sense it here in his life.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
The spiritual narrative is so interesting. And reading this biography, so I don't know if you have an answer to this question, but so many of us come to faith in Christ, often in a dualistic framework.
Yeah.
And so Herman Bartholomew speaks of that you're converted away from the world, and then you need to be converted back to the world. And so, especially with this background in the Reveil, which I think is this indispensable spark of living Christianity. I mean, what was it that enabled Groen so quickly to see that faith relates to the whole of life?
Yeah. I think his family background and his first occupation was important for him. He came from a wealthy family, he belonged to the elite of the Netherlands. They were educated to lead the nation. So he was educated as a jurist in Leiden. And then he became one of the secretaries of the king, King William I. So as a young man, he became in the upper levels of the Dutch government. So he was every day in the kitchen, let's say, of the king, writing for him, preparing advice, etc. So he was very much connected to what happened in politics, and he was interested in it. So he had a lot of comments already on the international politics when he was a young man serving the king. Sometimes he had to hide even his commentaries because he worked for the king, so he couldn't go full out. But he has a deep interest in, let's say, all the things of politics, of what was happening in society. And that remained. Although some other people from the Reveil moved away from politics, he entered deliberately the political scene. So that was also something remarkable that he made that step with a vision. So he was always working for vision to work with in the public sphere. And he was leading his fellow brothers of this movement to open their eyes for what could possibly be done as a Christian in the public sphere.
Extraordinary. Now, I don't know if you would agree with this, but when I was reflecting on the biography and Kroon's work, it seemed to me that if Kroon had one big idea, you might be able to encapsulate it in the word unbelief. And recently, in my own research, I found myself revisiting a book that Leslie Newbegin alerted me to, an astonishingly interesting book, Michael Buckley's book, At the Origins of Modern Atheism. And one of the things that Buckley points out, that there were two thinkers who recognized the significance of the emergence of modern atheism in Paris. So France, again. The one was Nietzsche, his Parable of the Madman, and the other one was John Henry Newman. And I think Buckley is absolutely right, where Nietzsche was absolutely prophetic. At the time, atheism was very controversial. What Nietzsche saw was the time would come when it would be completely normalized. And I believe that is the time in which we live now. It's just perfectly normal. And I find it has been normalized amongst, of course, the public, but amongst non-Christian and Christian scholars. So my sense is that, and this is why I think the soil of Dooyeweerd we may want to reattend to the soil, because my sense is that Groen was prophetic in this respect. As we struggle, but I think we struggle largely unconsciously with unbelief today. So do you think that Groen retains his relevance in this respect?
Yeah. Okay, we try to see some lines when Dooyeweerd talks about ground motives. I believe it all starts with Groen talking about what's really going on in the culture, and his shock was that the discovery that in the French Enlightenment, it's the French Enlightenment and the French Revolution was an expression of unbelief, of atheism. Nowadays, for him it was a ground motive. He says, "I'm not against the revolution as something that happened, but it's the total revolt. It's something in the mind. It's turning upside down all the ideas that we had. And in Christianity for him is Europe. So the Christianity is Europe. In the Christianity, we now turn everything upside down in our mind. So there's a new worldview expressing itself through this revolution. And he was pointing to unbelief, atheism, doing away with God in politics, doing away with the sovereignty of God in all areas of life. And that was also his prophetic insight, that that would be the end. Last week I talked to an historian. He said, I'm researching belief and revolution. And he said, I'm looking to all these people who were busy with the revolution. Yeah, in a way they were believers. Huh? So what we also say from Enlightenment philosophers, they were not against religion or against God, to Newton, etc. But that's not the point for Groen van Prinsterer. That there is some belief. Yeah, in a way, it illustrates what his point. Everyone has a belief, but it's the total worldview that makes its way through the revolution, and that's a worldview of a world. It's of a secular world, a world without God. So he was very sensitive to what secularism would work out in politics and culture. And at the same time, he emphasized that it were the ideas that were guiding people. So even Napoleon and others, the big figures in history, they were driven by ideas. So by ground motives. That's the one. And here's the line between Groen, let's say, worldview, ground motives. Yeah, and where we are now talking about today, the ground motives in our world. So the atheism or secularism. Although we know that indeed it's true, not that atheism is a minority belief. So people have more mixed beliefs than that they have a full-out atheism. So I think Charles Taylor is right when he says it's often a mixture. Nothing is lost. So that's also, let's say, a good idea, a comforting idea for us as Christians. Nothing is lost forever. When I walk in Cambridgeshire, it's all Christianity in the street here. Yes. So that's also true.
Yeah. So I'm going to move ahead. We both thought this was a very important question. So in my opinion, this is a major interest of mine. We seem today to be living through what I think is a very dangerous crashing of international law and the rules-based world order. And this crashing, of course, is being led by the Trump administration. But in my opinion, and of course you're welcome to disagree with me, sadly supported by many European allies of the US, and in that I include the United Kingdom. So one of the books I have at home that I'm reading is I think it's Michael Aubon, Complicity, on the role of the UK in the genocide in Gaza. So all of this has to do with international law, okay? And and of course, for better or for worse, international law has held Europe and the West since the end of World War II. And I would say that if you're going to trash this, you better know what you're doing. So what intrigued me so much is that, Groen had a major commitment to international law. And in your biography, you write this, henceforth, Kuiper got it from him. And you write this, henceforth, Kuiper would approach foreign policy in terms of strict international law, an approach that would remain a hallmark of later anti-revolutionaries. So, and I'm very interested, and some of the Dutch colleagues may want to come in on this conversation. Does that remain true among the heirs of the anti-revolutionaries in the Netherlands today?
Yeah, so first, indeed, Groen had a high expectation of international law. That was already formed for him when, so after the Napoleonic time, they had then the Congress of Vienna. They agreed for a new map, new nations in Europe. And he said, and his opinion was, when we want to avoid war again, we really have to be strict. We have to keep the agreements of Vienna. But in 1830, it was already violated in the Belgian Revolution, which made a big impression on Groen, that the big powers in Europe, like Austria and France and so, they didn't keep their own international agreement. And then he came to the reflection saying that international law is also holy. It's his expression. So law is holy, and that has to do for him also with his view on history, because he always thought about, let's say, the acts of God in history. So he said, when there is, let's say, when some things, law is formed in history, and it endures, it has a certain meaning, then it is perhaps, well, it is sometimes, it is the work of God. Yeah? This is Christian historic view on what happens in history. He was formed by the historic school of lawyers in Germany at this point, and Dooyeweerd would criticize him later for this, but okay, that's another thing. But and then we got Bismarck. Yeah, you were referring to Bismarck.
I wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
So just to interject.
Yeah, he saw Bismarck as a sort of new Napoleon, who was putting willpower above right. Yeah. So for whom it was clear, right, international right, law, justice is above might, above willpower of the state. It should be the case, and that's still the case for, in my opinion, the position of Christian politicians. So, the rule of law, justice is there to regulate power. But then Bismarck, so he was for him a sort of new Napoleon. So he was really upset by what was happening in Germany, in a war against Austria, the war against France. There were wars for the unification of Germany. And then he went to Berlin, and he was with a German friend there in Parliament, and he listened to Bismarck, who was talking in Parliament. And Bismarck said that he has been wrestling on his knees for the peace with Austria. And then Groen was shocked that Bismarck, which was such a realpolitiker, a willpower politician, that he used such things like his personal prayer while he was using force at the same time for that unification plan of Germany. Yeah. So, and that's happening today in our world too. You were mentioning some examples of what we are going through today. And in my opinion, so the willpower of the state is stepping through, is becoming stronger than the dedication to justice and international law. That's what we see at this moment, with America in a leading role. And I'm really concerned, I'm really worried. What you see that after a big world conflict, like at the end of the 19th century, after World War I and after World War II, then after such amount of violence and human casualties and death, etc., and genocide and whatever, then we start again with new commitments to international law. Right? So that happened after World War I and that happened after World War II, and now we are forgetting. But after, let's say, the period we are entering now, I think a new period is needed to rethink again the importance of international law for real peace.
Yeah, 100%. So just, I mean, this is what the thing on what struck me with Groen was, I mean, some people caricature the Dutch in this way, you know, of course, they're caricatures of the English and everything, but he was hardkoppig. You know, I mean, he was, once he had a view, he would pursue this view. So this critique of Bismarck was terribly unpopular. But do you think Groen had an inkling of the violence that might be unleashed in the following century?
I'm not sure. He was worried all the time. Probably over worried sometimes. That's also possible.
Which comes out in the book.
But he convinced Roel Kuiper on this point. You read the citation, because Kuiper also thought, okay, when Germany becomes strong and big, that's a good thing. It's a Protestant nation, isn't it? So when they the French, so well, many Christians thought it would be a good thing. But Groen was the opposite, because he emphasized the importance of international law. And he saw the nature of Bismarck. There's also this thing of, let's say, sort of going back to one's worldview or to ground motives. He saw in Bismarck a revolutionary, although Bismarck was considered as a conservative. But I don't know if he had, let's say, predicted World War I or World War II, but what he predicted was the nature of ideology. So also I believe the nature of communism and Nazi German ideology. Because he said, when people do away with God, when they break away with Christianity and the sovereignty of God, then they can have all kinds of idols. So this thought is already there, which we know well, and from later, let's say, Christian philosophers talking about God or the idols. It's a sort of Augustinian idea. Or we are directed to God, or we are directed to all kinds of idols. That's there included. When we had World War II in the Netherlands, we had then also a prime minister from this Antirevolutionary party, Colijn. And when the war was there and the Germans occupied the Netherlands, he said to the members of his party, the party was dissolved. Okay, now the party is dissolved, we are going underground somewhere, somehow. And now all read Unbeliever Revolution during this time of occupation. Will strengthen us spiritually in our resistance against the ideology of the Germans.
That's just extraordinary.
So around World War II, there was a sort of revival of this Unbeliever Revolution, reading and issuing new editions, reflection on Groen.
And we don't have time to reflect on this, but if you think of our consumer culture that we are so happy with, and since the end of World War II, and then I think the very dark clouds that are now gathering internationally, you wonder what it will take to rediscover the danger of unbelief, for Christian and for non-Christian. But just in conclusion, so, I mean, well, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I could keep going for hours. There's so much here to tease out. But I just want to speak personally for a moment. And I was introduced to the Kuiperian tradition as an evangelical by philosophers in South Africa, for which I remain extraordinarily grateful. But they gave me, they didn't just give me the impression, they virtually told me that Dooyeweerd and his co-workers had moved on far beyond Groen and Kuiper and Bartholomew and so on. And in fact, it was not uncommon for them to refer to Groen and Kuiper and Bartholomew as scholastic. So somehow, so that the effect on me was that it took me years to actually go and read Kuiper and Barth. And then, oh my goodness, it was, and I quote, this is incredibly fertile stuff. So when you spoke earlier, I find it mind-blowingly intriguing, although Adrienne could comment on this. I think Herman Dooyeweerd might not be happy that we now have philosophy finding a place at the Theological University of Utrecht. But it does seem to me that, I have argued against Dooyeweerd, that philosophy and theology are both foundational sciences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But just as we conclude, do you think there are things in Groen that we need to retrieve for today, even with Dooyeweerd and all this development that we have?
Yeah. So Colin said in the 1940s, read Unbelief in the Revolution. And I had that experience as a student. I started this conversation with my own experience, opening up my eyes for what was happening in culture and society, seen from a Christian perspective. I think that's still the contribution. One of the speakers this afternoon said, well, perhaps for me now it's less remarkable than when I started to discover this all, but it's still there. And I think it's this spiritual basis, and this, what you also say, this hardnekkig, hardkoppig. That's the English expression for hardkoppig. Yeah. But well, about Groen and Kuiper, when they got acquainted one with one another, Kuiper was a pastor in a local community. One of the first things that Groen did was he sent him a copy of Unbelief in the Revolution, and Kuiper read it, so it was very important for him as well. And he wrote back that he saw it as a sign it supported his self-confidence. That was the word that Kuiper said. So he got self-confidence through what Groen sent him. So, and they were really connected all their lifetime, also after Groen's death. When Kuiper wrote his last work, Antirevolutionary Staatkunde, Anti-Revolutionary Policies, in the 1917 or something, so 3 years before he died, it's all Groen over. So who of us will write in his 70s a book and then refer all the time to the person who was your inspiration? So this was the case for Abraham Kuiper, that Groen was his inspiration, offering him the key insights that he needed. And Dooyeweerd, to connect him to Kuiper, Dooyeweerd had also this key insight that he had from Kuiper, the notion of the heart. Dooyeweerd has spoken about this notion of the heart, that he got this, it is the heart as the center and also of all these functions and aspects, etc. He said, and also for the ground motives, so in the heart decides about your direction, what you believe. And then he said, I got this from a sermon that he read at a certain moment of Abraham Kuiper, about the heart is the center and things are going in and going out from the heart. So there are many, and the notion of common grace, I agree with you. Theology and philosophy, they are one in a way. Dooyeweerd uses the idea of common grace. Baving uses the idea of redemption is restoration. So they work all with the same basic theological concepts. I stop now because we can go on for hours.
But Roel, for me anyway, this has been absolutely fascinating. I love the book. I highly recommend it. And the other thing, I just want to thank the Dutch folk who are with us for having these books translated into English. As I've been, Otto has done such extraordinary work tonight, but I feel ashamed that I'm not multilingual in about 7 languages when I watch, the Dutch folk speaking, you speaking, Roel, and so on and so forth. But I do think as well that if these traditions have a future, we have to find ways to work together. So one of the things, interesting things in the Groen, but I won't ask you about this, is this persistent Protestant fragmentation. You know, it's so this group breaks off, that group breaks off, and I think the thing that saddened me about Groen, but maybe this is just the nature of the prophet, is the sort of aloneness of his journey. So fairly isolated, I think, at a lot of times, which one would hope one might be able to find ways to avoid. But the great news as well, I should tell you, is that Roel is about to submit another book for publication. So we just say, keep writing.
Okay, thank you very much.